What I'm hoping to do today is talk about cycling infrastructure in cities, how it's changing, and really what the last 6 months and the position we find ourselves in globally has done to change how people approach urban planning, design, and cycling in cities.
Well, we might want to start thinking about two stages of revolution or boom, the last 6 months and maybe the last 6 years. And that there's poetry to using six in both of those, but truth is, it's probably been somewhere between the last 5 to 10 years of a urban biking revolution in cities. And I've been observing this, and that's fast by city building standards. The idea that within 5 years, maybe even somewhere between 5 to 10, cities around the world could be transforming their thinking, their culture, their mindset, their skill set, and ultimately their infrastructure and even their land use planning around being more bike friendly, not just more bike friendly, but actually bike friendly.
From Peloton Magazine, this is Around, a new podcast documenting the transformation of cities and urban culture, e-bikes, commuting life, and the people and brands making a difference. Episode 1 is sponsored by our friends at iGo Electric Bikes. They offer urban, leisure, road, mountain, and fat bike options with 11 models and prices beginning at under $2,000. We have one of their carbon CGV bikes in our offices right now, and we love it. Check them out at www.igoelectric.com. Let's get to it. In this episode, we talked to contributing editor James Lynch about the Canyon Commuter Sport 8.0, the Specialized Vado 4.0 EQ, and the Batch e-bike. And we also spent some time with urban designer Brent Toderian. Brent has worked in Brisbane, Auckland, Buenos Aires, Copenhagen, Helsinki, New York, Oslo, and a host of other cities around the world. His insights are gold and worth a listen.
My name is James Lynch. I'm a contributor for Around. I'm the former head of outdoors for Popular Mechanics magazine. And now I've been doing freelance writing and podcasts about the outdoor industry and recreating in the outdoors.
So James, let's talk about the Canyon Commuter Sport 8.0 that you've been reviewing.
Yeah. The Canyon's been awesome. I'm a long-time fan of Canyon with their direct-to-consumer model of getting a bike delivered to you, and then you build it and you're good to go. The Commuter Sport I saw when it first came out, the most noticeable thing about it is its geometry. It's a little strange, a bit different, definitely eye-catching. I've described it to my friends as kind of a quasi-moto situation where the handlebars is like the high point of the bike. So every tube runs from the handlebars. And so it gives us kind of like hunchback look, almost like a bulldog. It's bulldogish, like doesn't have much of a neck, which is definitely a style choice that at first I wasn't sure about, but riding on it more and more, it became very endearing to me. It's funky. It's different. When you're riding this, it's very clear that you didn't drag this out of the back of your garage. You know, this isn't something found at a yard sale, something like that. It's a definite choice and it's striking, which is fun. And I found, as far as a commuter goes, this Canyon was a supremely smooth riding bike. It's a bike that lets you ride the bike without thinking about much else about it, which is exactly what you want if you're going to work every single day on this thing.
Awesome. And so tell me about the build process. You got the bike and you had mentioned that the build process was just really seamless. And
Canyon makes it really easy. I was a Connects kid growing up. You know, this reminds me more of like an erector set. There are like 4 or 5 parts that you have to bolt on. Canyon makes it really easy. You get a torque wrench that comes with the bike, which I've always found super helpful. So you have this torque wrench. It helps you get exactly where you want to go as far as tightness. You lock it in. You can be confident with the fit. And then you move on. And it comes in a standard bike box, and you don't need to know about the mechanics of a bike to put this together.
And then tell me, like, since you've ridden a few bikes for us for Around, where would you sort of categorize this bike? What sort of end user do you see this bike being popular with? Who's the customer for this bike, would you say?
Yeah. They market it as a commuter, and I think it's a great target audience for this. The person who's trying to go to work. I think of this as a bike for someone who is athletic, maybe is used to jogging, maybe, plays in a rec softball league, someone who's used to being active, but has not really ridden a bike since, they were 10 years old, something like that. But they look at biking and they say, I'm an athletic guy or lady, and I want to get to work. This seems like a great way to do it, but I just don't know anything about bikes. I don't want to mess with a chain. I don't know how to adjust my derailleurs, and I'm not interested in it per se. Like, I just want something that I can ride. The reason I say someone who's a little bit more athletic is that this isn't a beach cruiser with a big fat Barca lounger seat. It's got a saddle like you might see on a road bike, pretty narrow. It lets you ride and push the pedals pretty aggressively.
It's belt drive, correct?
It is belt drive. I mean, as far as maintenance goes on this bike, I hear that with a lot of people, a lot of my friends who get into cycling. I think even my father, who, I want to ride my bike, but I don't want to mess with these things. My chain's falling off now. I've got grease on my fingers. If I'm biking to work, maybe I don't have a shower there. It's a short ride. But if I get grease all over my pant leg, well, it doesn't really do me any good because now I'm not prepared for work. This is so maintenance free. It's belt driven, which is really cool. Motorcycles, cars use belts, but there aren't a ton in the biking world. So what that means is that you don't have the chain. You don't have chain grease. You don't have cleaning your chain. And then often what I think really pushes a lot of people away from cycling is you don't have that crunching, creaking chain that doesn't want to move and makes it harder to bike than it was when you bought the bike. With this thing, if it gets wet, if you're riding it every day, it just won't require the same level of maintenance as a metal grease chain.
It's such a simple, clean, refined design too. It's a cool design.
It really is. It really is. I mean, when you think about this is designed to, in my experience with riding it, is this bike is designed to ride the bike, get off the bike, go to work, and then ride home. Like, there's not a lot of other input you have to put into it other than pedaling and steering. You don't need to have a whole new system to get to and from work. This should fit into a lot of lives without a lot of change, which means you'll use it more.
So there's also 2 other bikes that you're working on, and we're going to talk about those in the upcoming weeks. So maybe let's start with the Specialized and then move on from there.
So I've been riding around on the Specialized Turbo Vado SL 4.0 EQ, this really awesome, super fun e-bike. Specialized did a really cool job with this in that at first glance, you wouldn't really know this is an e-bike. The battery is contained in the geometry of the bike. It's pretty streamlined. It's not chunky. It doesn't look like your standard e-bike, but it comes with a bunch of great features like racks, guards, things to make it easy to ride. And it's also just super fun. If you put this thing on turbo mode and you start pedaling, it has pedal assist and you are just cooking. Like, I've gotten, you're just cruising low to mid 20s down the road. And, I'm wearing a backpack on a hot day. I'm not sweating at all. And I'm just moving efficiently through the city. It's a ton of fun. I've been riding. I'm looking forward to riding it even more and getting a better sense of exactly what its limits are.
And then the next bike you're also looking at that you've been riding?
I'm riding a Batch Bicycles e-bike. It's about $1,300 less than the Specialized. And it has some of those. It's more like a traditional e-bike. It's got a big battery on the outside that you see. It looks like an e-bike. It definitely doesn't have the finishing touches of the Specialized. I think they bring a lot of the cycling world to the e-bike, whereas the Batch Bicycles is much more e-bike first, without, maybe the years and years of Specialized experience in cycling. So it's a little bit less refined in feeling, but it is so fun to ride. It has great pedal assist. I was actually pretty surprised at how well it did and how much fun it was to ride, how efficiently it moved. It worked. It was easy to hop on, figure out the simple systems. And again, I think with more and more riding on this, we'll see where it stacks up to Specialized, but at about 2/3 the cost of the Specialized. I've been very impressed so far with the ride of the Batch bicycle, the e-bike from Batch. I'm James Lynch here with Brent Toderian, who is a thought leader in advanced urbanism, city planning, urban design, with more than 20 years of experience. He has been the chief subdivision neighborhood planner in Calgary. He's been Vancouver's chief planner. He helped with the 2010 Winter Olympics, planning and design, and has worked in cities around the world, including Copenhagen, the Gold Coast, Helsinki, Medellin, New York, Oslo. The list goes on and on. Brent, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, James. Nice to talk to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here today. What I'm hoping to do today is talk about cycling infrastructure in cities, how it's changing, in really what the last 6 months and the position we find ourselves in globally has done to change how people approach urban planning, design, and cycling in cities. So just to start, what are the big changes, the momentum swings that we've seen in the last 6 months when it comes to designing our cities and getting people on bikes?
Well, we might want to start thinking about two stages of revolution or boom, the last 6 months and maybe the last 6 years. And that there's poetry to using six in both of those, but truth is, it's probably been somewhere between the last 5 to 10 years of a urban biking revolution in cities. And I've been observing this, and that's fast by city building standards. The idea that within 5 years, maybe even somewhere between 5 to 10, cities around the world could be transforming their thinking, their culture, their mindset, their skill set, and ultimately their infrastructure and even their land use planning around being more bike friendly, not just more bike friendly, but actually bike friendly as a way of getting around, not just as a source of recreation or exercise, but as a mobility choice, an attractive and convenient and viable mobility choice. We've been talking about that bike boom for years now, for at least 5 years, and how much it's been changing cities. And all of that seemed really fast by city building standards. Then we have this 5 to 6 month period during the coronavirus pandemic, where we've got a bike boom that makes the old bike boom look downright slow by comparison, because now we're seeing what fast really means when you have a legitimate crisis, and bike infrastructure and bike accessibility becomes a major part of the conversation about how to address the pandemic crisis. And so we're seeing conversations vastly accelerated. Things that were planned over 5 years are happening within weeks in certain cities. Cities that had never had a serious political interest in having conversations about transforming lanes of car traffic into lanes for biking and walking are now doing it, at least temporarily. And they're also reconsidering street space for other things, just physical exercise and social interaction, and outdoor seating space to save restaurants from oblivion. So street space is being reconsidered for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is for safe bike travel, bike infrastructure for bike transportation. So all of this is happening incredibly quickly, but I want to put it into the context of the bike boom we were already in, which was fast by usual standards, but it seems slow now compared to the transformation we're seeing during the pandemic.
What solutions does biking give for the very specific problems of COVID-19 that we're seeing around the world that has fueled this uptick in the speed of this great change to how we approach cycling?
Well, it really just hyperinflates the conversation we were having before about the problem with how much space we had surrendered to cars and how little space that left over for everything else, including walking, biking, and transit movement. When we'd given away so much to the car, we created a level of car dependency, and we made it hard to make anything else practical or enjoyable as other ways of getting around. So that was noticeable before. That was a problem before, a major issue facing cities. But then during the pandemic, when we suddenly, in addition to our regular spatial challenges, had to stay 6 feet or 2 meters away from each other, that really hyper accelerated the conversation, made it even more obvious how little space there was left over for everything else after surrendering to the cars. And so whether it's walking, whether it's biking, whether it's safe transit ridership, whether it's, again, outdoor seating space, even outdoor retail selling space to keep small businesses afloat. The pandemic just made everything feel even more tight. So it took a pre-existing condition, if you will, to use a phrase popular in United States medical conversations. We had a pre-existing condition in our cities that the coronavirus made even worse because we had to stay even further away from each other in these tight, finite spaces left over from surrendering to the cars.
We've talked about this 6 years or so, this momentum has swelled. And now we have the pre-existing condition to really start taking action, making some of these changes that maybe the political climate didn't support in the same way 5 years ago. But now situations change. People are ready for some change.
At least temporarily. And the real question, particularly in North America, is will that appetite to rethink road space, street space for anything, including for bikes, will that survive the end of the pandemic, or will we have just a quick going back to normal, quote unquote, the old normal? And let's be clear, we could end up with a much worse normal if this narrative around a fear of viral spread makes people more interested in driving a car than taking the bus. We could see levels of car-related gridlock like we've never seen before. So as this bus versus transit versus cars safety issue plays out, bikes have become particularly important, because if people are in the short term afraid to take public transit, and I think it should only be a short term thing, if they switch to bike trips, that can actually be a benefit for cities. Any transit trip that becomes a walking or biking trip is actually a net improvement in the way cities function. But any transit trip that turns into a car trip is a significant negative detriment to the way cities function.
I know when I have a lot of family who does not ride bikes like I do presently, and hopefully they would if there was more infrastructure. But a lot of the things I hear from them, if I'm riding in a car with them somewhere, is people in cars complaining about people on bikes. But as someone who bikes places, I know that I'm not searching for a parking spot when I get there. And I know that I'm not taking a parking spot from someone else who arrives in a car. How does having more people on bikes benefit people who, for whatever reason, can't or choose not to ride a bike in a city?
Yeah. Well, the fact is, and this is not an ideology, this is not an opinion, this is a fact from an expert on cities, that the more people bike in cities, the better the city works for everyone, including drivers. So this narrative of bikes versus cars is not only unhelpful, it's just inaccurate. The one thing we know is that if everyone tries to move in a car in any city, even a low density city, let alone a place like Manhattan, if everyone tries to move by car, nobody moves well, because cars take up too much space. We have to spend massive amounts of money and tear down a remarkable amount of city actual things in order to make space for all the car movement. And guess what? The more space you actually give cars, the more people drive, and you end up in the same congestion after spending billions. So the narrative that this is cars versus bikes, just anyone who says it's an indicator for me of how little they understand cities or just geometry. And I say this as someone who is not a bike activist. I am not even a bike advocate. What I am is a city expert. What I am is a city maker. I'm an advocate for better cities and an expert who knows how to actually achieve better cities. And so I come at the bike question from that lens. I actually find it often unhelpful when, car advocates are debating with bike advocates about the relative merits of their object, the car or the bike. For me, my object is the city. My object is society. My object is how we all work together better, more successfully in every possible way we can define that, from economic success to social equity and racism to climate emissions, etc. every possible way we measure success, the more we ride bikes in our cities instead of driving, the better it is for the public interest. It saves money, both in infrastructure and public health costs. It reduces emissions substantially. It makes us healthier and live longer. There's just all sorts of ways that it benefits the public interest. So this incredibly lazy and uninformed narrative that it's bikes versus cars can be frustrating. And sometimes bike activists actually feed that narrative, which I don't find particularly helpful in challenging the amount of space we've surrendered to cars. So I think we need a narrative like we treat public health issues, even like we treat pandemics, where there's a level of expertise and information brought to the conversation that isn't about anecdote, that isn't about emotion, that isn't about I saw this bike rider do this one thing once, and that anecdote suggests that that's how all bike riders behave. You know, it's amazing how much energy gets sucked out of the room, or oxygen gets sucked out of the room in what should be a real conversation about how to make cities work better for everyone, including drivers. The people who ride bikes actually have the intellectual high ground because bike riding is better for cities. But you can lose that high ground if you're just having the wrong conversation about why we should be making bikes safer, bike infrastructure safer, more convenient, more prevalent, a more enjoyable and enticing alternative to the car. It works better for everyone, including drivers. And by the way, if you're a driver and you need to or just want to use your car, the best thing you can hope for is that walking, biking, and transit is as attractive as possible. If you're a person of color and you're actually concerned about the safety of streets and thus want to drive more, even though racism can play out in your car just as easy as on the street in the context of a police stop, for example. But if that's your perspective and that's your reality, the best thing you can hope for is other people walking, biking, and taking public transit again, so they're not competing with you for the finite space on the road in front of you and behind you. So anyone who or a disability advocate or people talking about people with disabilities needing to drive vehicles, anybody who needs to drive vehicles or just wants to drive vehicles because they want to take their kids to hockey on the other side of the region, whatever storyline I hear from thousands of conversations with citizens around the world, anyone who feels that way and wants those things has to understand that it's in all of our best interests for walking, biking, and transit to be more attractive to everyone else, because the more likely other people are to not drive, the easier it is for you to drive.
When we think about that, making these other means of transportation more attractive and also moving away from a narrative of bikes versus cars, how has your strategy of prioritizing versus balancing played out in how you design these spaces?
I'm not a big fan of the word balance when it comes to mobility, because balance usually, I've had about thousands of conversations with chief transportation officials and mayors and politicians. And what I've observed is that balance is usually code for the status quo, only slightly better. Anything I've ever seen done in the context of language like balance seems like usually window dressing, where at best, it's just an increase attention in walking, biking, and transit, but never anything that's even close to balance. And what I've actually observed is that even if your actual real goal was balance, by definition, you would have to prioritize walking and biking and transit for a few decades to just give it a chance to catch up. The analogy I use I'll use the Imperial for Americans. It's like 100-yard dash race, or in the Paralympics, a wheelchair race. And you've given the car a 90-yard head start, and then you're talking about balance. So by definition, even if your goal was balance, you needed to flip the prioritization that you've had existing for decades now. because the car has been prioritized for decades, since at least the 1960s.
I know one of the things we mentioned earlier was that we were seeing real change in taking space from cars, with restaurants in major cities like New York moving some of their seating outside. There's a real financial business benefit to that decision. Are there financial tools, or do they already exist? We just need to illuminate them, of taking space from cars or bikes. Is there a way to tie it to financial gain for a city?
Well, we've been, I actually have a hashtag that I use on Twitter called City Making Math, hashtag City Making Math. And every time I find good data, and I don't like math as a person, I always joked it was my least favorite subject in school, but I love using math as part of making a case and storytelling, because data and math can be quite powerful and influential, and financial math is particularly important. We know from study after study after study that the more people walk, bike, and take public transit, the more it saves public money, the more it saves public space. And that's before we even calculate the almost incalculable consequences of things like climate change or racism or something like that, that has its overlap with whether infrastructure is safe for people. So it's the data is on our side, the math is on our side. The financial argument for more bike riding in cities, safe public bike infrastructure, safe public transit and walking infrastructure in cities is unassailable. It's just obvious. What's not happening is it's not being listened to. We are still putting the vast majority of our public money into the least effective way of getting around, the most expensive and least effective way of getting around, because of a particular ideology around personal freedom, which is ironic because all it creates is a freedom to be stuck in traffic. If you can combine real data with influential storytelling, that's how you change people's minds. That's how you change decision makers' minds, is what I find.
So when a group of businesses hears something like that, but then looks at their own city and says something along the lines of, that's all fine and dandy, but we don't have any cyclists in our city.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a quote, I believe it came from you. Please correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm misquoting you here. It's hard to justify a bridge by the number of people swimming across a raging crocodile-filled river. In that, my understanding here being that if it's dangerous to bike, people aren't going to bike. But these opportunities do exist if we create the means for them to exist. Is that fair?
Yes, that's my quote. I'm not the first person who said it. I have no idea. I've been hearing it as, it's like that one of those old sayings your mother used to say, I think. I've modified it quite a bit. Raging crocodile filled is my latest iteration of
Some
it.
great adjectives in there for sure.
But the point of it is, and it's true of walking infrastructure, it's true of public transit, you can't assume the demand for something based on the people who are trying to use it when it's horrible or dangerous. And that's true of many things. What you have to do is actually decide, do you want people in your city to ride bikes? Not decide, are they riding bikes? Because it's a question of vision. And if the answer is yes, we want people to ride bikes, then you figure out the way to achieve that, including safe infrastructure, but not just limited to that.
Yeah, I mean, that is a dark situation. And I know growing up, we didn't get a light outside my neighborhood until there were a certain number of car accidents there and a certain number of people died, which is a scary thing when you realize that's how some of this infrastructure works. And I'm wondering if there is the potential for a leap past that. I'm thinking about a concept, which I've heard you talk about before, the law of congestion, which is my understanding is that if you add another lane to a highway to reduce car congestion and traffic time, inversely, you actually increase the car usage on the freeway, you increase wait times, you increase traffic. I'm wondering,
you increase driving right off the bat. It's law of congestion is also called induced demand or induced traffic or induced driving. In other words, you induce it by providing the infrastructure. You make people who weren't driving because of the congestion reconsider that decision, and maybe they drive more trips each day, or they're willing to commute longer because some capacity has been added, and thus that capacity gets quickly filled up. It's called the law of congestion because it's a law. This study after study has shown that this is a truth, and yet we keep trying to do it anyway. Every politician who's ever opened a road and ribbon cutting has said that those new lanes or that new road will reduce congestion, even though we know that's a lie. What we know is that within about 3 years, 50% of the new capacity is filled up, and within about 5 years, 100%, or even 120% of it will fill up. So at best, you're getting a 3 to 5 year slight improvement until it fills up again. And then you need to have that same multi-billion-dollar conversation again.
And so if a city takes a leap and utilize what they know about the law of congestion, but instead uses it for bikes and walking instead of for cars, yes. Go creating the infrastructure and allowing it to fill up with bikes and cars, do cities see those results in the same way that highways see those results? Like the increase in usage of those systems of transportation, biking and walking?
Well, the obvious example is Paris right now. That, a lot of North Americans think Paris is like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, that there's bikes everywhere and that nobody drives. Clearly, those people have not been to Paris in the last decade. Paris, it was a city choking in cars, literally choking because of the air pollution. And if you ever tried to get around anywhere in a taxi or in a bus, ironically as part of public transit, you could spend a half hour trying to turn a corner because the city was close to paralyzed. Within weeks, not within years even, let alone decades, but within weeks during the pandemic, the number of people riding bikes in Paris because of the transformation of safe bike infrastructure has been remarkable. People are comparing it to Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And it's remarkable. I use that. So it feeds the narrative that if you do not just provide the infrastructure, but do a good job with it, the truth is any North American city that does the same thing will have the same results. The problem is North American cities are not doing the same thing. And ironically, we use that as evidence that we can't change. It's so, we don't build safe bike infrastructure, people don't bike, and then we say, see, no one will ever bike here. It's actually a ludicrous logical fallacy.
For people who hear things like that and who maybe are cyclists, split their time between driving and cycling, or are drivers but like the sound of these benefits to their communities and cities, what can individuals do to help make those changes happen in their cities?
Well, I think it first starts with a mindset shift. And I just want to obliterate this narrative that speaks about bikes versus cars or bikes versus transit. Cities, and particularly more urban cities, only work when there's lots of enjoyable ways to get around, lots of practical ways to get around, including the car. I don't think the car is going to go anywhere, but car dependency has to go away. We have to redesign car dependency out of our cities and suburbs. Not the car out of our cities and suburbs, but car dependency. And in the most urban places, like downtown Manhattan, we might talk about more significant moves. But in most of North America is not Manhattan. So we're not going to have a similar conversation. The car is not going to go away, but the car dependency can't continue because the costs and consequences of it are just too significant. So I think we have to change the conversation, change the narrative. Polarization doesn't help. So-called aggressive bike activism actually, I think, does the cause a disservice because it pits one party against another instead of just pulling up the conversation and asking, well, how will this work better for everyone? What I say to the bike activists is you win that debate. If you have the debate about how it works better for everyone, you win that debate. How you lose that debate is by making it just seem like I like my bike better than I like your car narrative, which is a reductionist narrative that actually you lose because that's an emotional conversation. And I think the car owners win, car drivers and car dependency and car sellers win emotional debates, whereas multimodal advocates win fact-based debates.
Something that made me feel better is learning that these cities that we think of as these biking meccas and utopias were not always that way and did have these downtown highways.
Three things I do because I work in contexts all over the world. One, I say, even if you roll your eyes at the Amsterdams and the Copenhagens and even the Parises, never underestimate the power of just inspiration. That the idea that you can see something that is completely different than what you have and be inspired by it. Not to think you can copy it perfectly, but that you can rethink what you assumed was possible in your city. Never underestimate the power of inspiration and competition. I actually really like stoking competition between different cities because that can actually get mayors to do things sometimes faster than they otherwise would. That's the one thing I say. Secondly, as you say, I always point out that those cities that inspire us weren't always that way. So you can't write them off as having always been different, because the facts are that European cities before the 1970s oil crisis had bought in full force, had put their foot on the gas towards full car culture, learning from North America, because everybody thought North America had it right back then. And they were choking in cars and choking in traffic. And it was the oil crisis that made European cities rethink that. And so a lot of this is about how you rethink things in the face of a crisis like our pandemic crisis right now. So you can't write off those cities as having always been that way, because they weren't. So we hit that point over and over again. That's the second point I make. The third point I make, though, is there are times when I don't want to talk about Amsterdam or Copenhagen or Paris at all, because it's still too easy for the lazy thinkers out there to just say, well, we're not like fill in the blank because of fill in the blank. So I like using North American cities who are doing remarkable things by North American standards. I like similar size and vintage and scale and nature that are doing things. So I'm constantly looking for different cities that are of different natures that are doing different things, including in North America, and saying, listen, if they're doing it, what's your excuse? And they're not Copenhagen, sure, but they doubled their urban biking share within 5 years or something like that. And even if it's doubling from a low number, that's still significant. And here's how they did it. So it's really important to be able to use more obviously comparable examples from your continent, because they can't be written off so easily. I always called Vancouver the city you couldn't ignore because it's doing remarkable things, but it's not in Europe or it's not overseas. It's in good old North America, where and it grew up around car culture, and it grew up in a time where cars were dominant. So all these excuses other cities use for why they can't be like European cities, Vancouver had those excuses and did it anyway.
Brent, I want to thank you so much for your time and expertise. I've really enjoyed talking about this. For people who want to learn more about you and what you're doing, where can they find out more?
Most people find me on Twitter at Brent Toderian, but I'm very active on Twitter and share a lot of information there. So that's the best way and easiest way to keep tabs on what I'm working on.
We want to again thank our friends at igoelectric.com for their support of Around. Please visit them and check out their offerings. Also, remember to visit aroundonbikes.com and sign up for our weekly newsletter and read the full review of the bikes mentioned in our podcast, as well as other inspiring features about cities, e-bikes, and more.